Good. Okay, great. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, good morning. My name is Lisa Seco, and I am a plant ecologist with Seattle Parks and Recreation, and I work on the Green Seattle Partnership, and will be your host for today. Each year, we host several webinars open to the public on some of our favorite topics, and today we'll be focusing on pollinator habitat, and we'll be welcoming Katie Buckley, who is a pollinator ecologist with Washington State Department of Agriculture. Before we get started, I want to cover a couple basics so that things go smoothly today. First off, we're on Zoom. I think most folks are pretty familiar with it now, but I did want to point out a couple things. So everybody's muted and they'll have their videos off. The presentation is being recorded and it will be posted online in a couple days in case you have folks that you'd like to share it with. If you do need closed captioning, you can turn that on in the toolbar that's at the bottom of your screen. And then for questions today, we ask that you use the Q&A box for questions for the presenter about the presentation itself. And then for the chat box, if you have questions where you need help with audio problems or anything like that, feel free to use chat in that way. Yeah, that should help us all out. Next slide. So Green Seattle Partnership is a collaborative effort to restore the ecological function and community connection to the forested parklands of Seattle, including the West Duwamish Greenbelt that's shown here in the photo. So as such, we wanted to honor the original stewards of these lands. Seattle occupies the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, the land which touches the shared water of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land we stand on and resisting the erasure of Indigenous past, present, and future. So, Katie Buckley will join us here, and I'd like to provide a brief bio. Katie has her Bachelor's of Science in Entomology from Purdue University, a Master's of Science in Entomology from the University of Florida, and a PhD in Entomology from Washington State University. For her master's work, she worked in the University of Florida Honeybee Research and Extension Lab on creating habitat for native bees in agriculture settings. Her doctorate research was on using sagebrush steppe habitat restoration in vineyards to help beneficial and pest insect communities. She worked as a pest biologist for the Washington State Department of Agriculture running weed species surveys and is now the Washington State Department of Agriculture Pollinator Health Coordinator. She also has been a hobbyist beekeeper for the last 4 years with a huge passion for gardening. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. And I will get right into this. So I'm going to start off by talking about, what are pollinators? Why are they important? A brief history of the politics of pollinators, and then what the Pollinator Health Task Force has been up to, and what cool new things do we have coming down the pipeline. A brief community ecology primer that will explain explain a lot about pollinators and their places in forests and how we can create habitat for them. And then kind of lessons on pollinator habitat and what you can do in your own backyard when you're not, helping Sustainable Seattle do restoration work in their forests. So what can you do on a small scale? All right, so very briefly, pollinators it's really just an organism that moves pollen from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower. And there are a lot of different ones, including beetles, wasps, ants, butterflies, moths, flies, occasionally grasshoppers, crickets, and cockroaches, birds, occasionally mammals, mostly bats, which we do not have in Washington. So a little upset about that. Reptiles, very rarely. There's like a gecko in Madagascar. And then very importantly, bees. So why are they so important? Well, it's because 90% of flowering plant species require a biotic pollinator to reproduce. Many pollinators are specialists and they're tightly linked to a genus or species of plant. So if that plant goes extinct or if that pollinator goes extinct, then that pollinator or plant is going to have some issues. 75% of crop species rely to some degree on biotic pollinators. So, that's kind of important for us and the food that we eat. That's estimated to represent about a third of the human diet, and most of the things give us vitamin C so we don't develop scurvy. Basically fruits, nuts, and most vegetables. All right, so in Washington specifically, we're a fairly pollinator centric state as far as agriculture is concerned. These are kind of our numbers in 2019 for some of our very world-class commodities. If you took away pollinators, that's kind of what would be left. And honestly, if you took away the things that were not normally attractive to pollinators, that's all you'd be left with. So our food pantry starts to look a little bit bare when you get rid of pollinators. Anyway, so why are bees so important? And I'd spend a lot of time, too much time sometimes, talking about bees. Well, they're pollinators, that their food is completely provided by flowers. So their larvae eat nectar and pollen, and the adults eat nectar and pollen. That's very different from certain other pollinators where the adult may be the only one who's feeding on nectar, and their larvae eat something completely different, like plant leaves or insect hosts. Anyway, so bees, again, very important. There's estimated at the moment to be about 20,000 species of bees worldwide. This says over 500 species in Washington. We think it's over 600 now, and more on that later. Most bees are actually solitary. They're not social. So they nest in the ground by themselves. The female will build a nest and provision a little pollen ball. The other ones will nest in things like wood tunnels, hollow reeds, and cavities. And there's a very large variance in size and color. So that's the pollen ball, and she'll lay a single egg on it and hatch that single little larva, and that will develop underground. And then, next year it will emerge as an adult bee. So some bees, besides honeybees, because there is this really large variation and many people are not familiar with them, we have bumblebees, carpenter bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees, sweat bees, longhorn bees, stingless bees, blueberry bees, cuckoo bees, and many, many more besides these. They range in size from, at least in this area, bumblebee queens are going to be the largest bees you see. Some of the smallest ones are these little lasioglossum sweat bees. We also have some other ones, yellow-faced bees, that are also very, very tiny. Most people don't recognize these as bees because they're like, what are those little flies buzzing around the flowers? They're tiny, tiny bees. So what has been going on with politics and pollinators, and where are we kind of going from here? Brief history, honeybee colonies peaked in the US in about 1950, and there's been a gradual decline since then until veromites were introduced in the 80s, which led to a fairly sharp decline. In 2006, colony collapse disorder was recognized. 2015, the Obama administration called for a federal pollinator health task force, which released a report calling for states to put together these managed pollinator protection plans, MP3s for short, in 2016. Washington State published ours in 2018. It was an 11-page document and changed basically nothing. But what was happening around the same time is that there are national organizations for state legislators, and a few of our state legislators attended a meeting where they talked about pollinators as an issue that could be addressed in state legislature. And they decided that this was a really important issue. And so they wrote SSB 5552, which acknowledged the importance of and threat to pollinators in Washington, created my program, created the Pollinator Health Task Force, and made pollinators one of the priorities for all state land managing agencies. Yes, all of them. And so I got hired to run the USDA pollinator program and to chair the Pollinator Health Task Force. And we met for the first time in December of 2019. Started all kinds of stuff. We figured out a starting point for putting together recommendations, which is what the legislature wanted us to work on. We stole those from Minnesota, by the way. They think that's hilarious. Anyway, so we had 5 subcommittees trying to address habitat, pesticides, education, manage pollinators, and research. And that same week, we got our first report of Asian giant hornet in the state, now known as northern giant hornet. The following week, we found out that we had Houdini fly, which is a kleptoparasite on very specific species of mason bees, also in the state. What was really funny about this was I started working on pollinators and was like, yeah, I don't have to work on invasive species anymore because that's what I previously did, all pollinators all the time. And then in 2 weeks, I got 2 that landed on my desk. I was like, no. So yeah, the last time we had an invasive species that really impacted pollinators that we were very concerned about was in the 80s with varroa mite. So it had been a while, and I got 2 in like a 2-week span. But so the task force is comprised of a variety of stakeholders, including state agency representatives, pesticides people, conservation people, agricultural representatives, tribal representatives, managed pollinator representatives, meaning beekeepers, and many other people besides. If you guys are interested in being on this task force or receiving updates, at the end of the presentation, I'll have information. You can totally contact me about participating in this. Anyway, so we did that first year in 2020, finish putting together our recommendations to the legislature. We had about 40 something recommendations, and apparently they really liked it because the very next year they passed SB 5253 that implemented about 30 something of our 40 something recommendations. And then they fully funded it, which we were not really expecting. So we spent last year putting together this implementation plan and a report on pollinators and neonicotinoid pesticides, and finished those. They're up on our website. So this year, we have been working on implementing a lot of these programs that we said we would. So 5253 created a lot of new things, made some state law changes, and I'm going to go through some of those that are applicable to pretty much everybody. But one of the very notable things that we're starting to really try to talk to people about, all public works projects that include landscaping must now have at least 25% of that landscaping be pollinator habitat as practicable. I say now. We have I guess more on that in a sec, but if you work for a municipality, it's good to know this. That's going to go into effect fairly soon. So other things that it did, we have an invasive bumblebee in Washington now, Bombus impatiens, the eastern bumblebee. And we just had the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, just got listed as a priority species by the state. We're kind of expecting a federal ESA listing to follow fairly soon, but they take longer than we do. Because of these things, it is now illegal to use non-native bumblebees in open field agricultural use because we'd really rather not get another invasive bumblebee species. And they do compete with our natives and spread diseases. So that's a thing. Our pesticide management division had to do a whole bunch of stuff, and a lot of the things that we discovered when we stole Minnesota's recommendations was they were recommending things that we already did. So with regards to pesticides, Washington has actually been doing a pretty good job. Other things, WDFW had to do some stuff on restoration techniques and updating their habitat recommendations to include pollinator related things. The Conservation Commission has or will have 2 different grant programs about pollinator habitat. One of them is their Sustainable Farm and Fields grant program that has gone live this year. That's mostly for farmers and people with farm and fields. Is really around sustainable agriculture, but any grants that include pollinator habitat will be prioritized. The other one that we're hoping will go live next year is a small grants program for basically anybody who wants to put in pollinator habitat, and there will be technical and financial assistance to do that. So we're hoping that goes live next year. I'm sure I'll be updating that as it happens. So yes, Sustainable Farm and Fields is up on their website. There's the link for it if you are interested. Anyway, pretty much all of the other stuff came to me. Yay. So I've been doing things like reporting annually to the Noxious Weed Board about pollinator issues, educating the public through plant nurseries, surveying beekeepers, maintaining partnerships with a whole bunch of different people. I'm totally working on the website. It's definitely something that's happening. I'm developing a list of native forage plants that's supposed to go into effect before that public works project requirement, because that's going to be part of here's how you actually do that. And basically just a whole bunch of other stuff. And I'm going to talk about a few of these in a little bit more detail. One of the projects, we want to know actually what species we have in this state, because it's been very undersampled for bees compared to certain other areas. So we have a team from the WSDA and a team from WSU that are putting together all known bee species data from museum records and other types of records, and digitizing WSU's collection. So hopefully we'll have a list of known species and a list of areas that have been undersampled and that need some more sampling, so that when we start our Washington Bee Atlas next year, which is based on the Oregon Bee Atlas, we will have areas to go sample and have an idea of bees that we should be looking for, and groups of bees that we don't know enough about. As an example, this is a male longhorn bee from the genus Melisodes, and the taxonomist from the Oregon Bee Project and I have no idea what species this is, and it is the most common bee that is out on the sunflowers in my front yard. I don't know what it is. Melisodes has been the longhorn bees in general have been very poorly studied in this area, and there are no good keys to them. So I'm excited to find out what this bee is and more besides. So that will be going live next year if you want to volunteer for that. Noxious weeds, we're working on a report on noxious weeds and pollinators. Hopefully that will be ready sometime next year. Education through nurseries. I sent out a whole bunch of stuff, these beautiful pollinator postcards to plant nurseries across the state. We have a east of the Cascades and a west of the Cascades. They have these beautiful lists of when these things are blooming, what colors they are. We're working on some more pesticide related ones, including something very similar to this. It's just not finalized yet. So we will hopefully have those out, possibly also to nurseries, but certainly on our website for people to hand out. So lots of great information that we're trying to get out there, and I'm definitely working on my website. This will be in English and Spanish. OSU has also put out this blue orchard bee management, which because of Houdini fly has been a higher priority for at least people who have mason bees. So this is our current website, and I'm seriously working on updating it. But if you're interested in the task force, I do have all of the meeting minutes posted. They're actually reasonably up to date now, and all of the reports that we've published are on here. The forage list that we're working on will also be on here, and this is what it looked like, but it's still getting worked on. So we have, I think it was over 300 plants, when they bloom, what types of pollinators they attract, where are they native to, east side versus west side, and we'll hopefully have that up sometime this fall on the website. All right, so I'm going to kind of take a break of pollinators specifically and do a brief primary on community ecology, because this is going to be important. All right, so first off, what is disturbance? Okay, so disturbance can kind of be anything that disturbs a community or a landscape. Volcanoes, forest fires, mowing, logging, mudslides, flooding. A lot of different things can be considered disturbance. Disturbance will typically result in either primary succession or secondary succession. Primary succession is going to be when it's basically bare rock. So a really great example of that is a volcanic eruption. Secondary succession is going to be when there's still like soil left. You may have stuff underground. There's a lot of biological material because soil is a living organism, or so my soil science teacher always liked to tell us. So if there's still soil, it's not bare rock, it's secondary succession. Life will come back way, way faster. You'll notice that this is, 1 to 2 years out, there's annual plants, and on the previous one, this can take a really, really long time, like hundreds of years long time. So, like I said, really good example of this is a volcanic eruption. And we have a great example in basically our own backyard with Mount St. Helens. Since it erupted in the 1980s, this has basically been a giant living landscape of an experiment in watching how succession happens. And for most of this was primary succession. There were some areas that were not hit as bad where it was secondary succession. And in those places, stuff has come back a lot faster. But this is a great example of what succession looks like on a very large scale. But this can be on a much smaller scale too. So this is in a little off the road sort of cul-de-sac that caught fire last year. And these are all like cottonwoods that burned. And this was this year. I took this photo a few days ago, and the milkweeds grew back really fast. All of the cottonwoods are growing back from stumps. This is well on its way to succession. But so how does this all fit in and create habitat? Well, different types of plants prefer different, basically, areas of succession. You have pioneer species, and a lot of those are annuals, or grasses and perennials that come in later. A lot of the smaller forbs and grasses. And then like later you start to get shrubs and maybe longer lived grasses, and you start to get trees sometimes. And then eventually you'll get a climax community, which is basically, you know, everything has stabilized a very long time after disturbance, and you have this mature community. And these examples are saying, you know, mature oak and hickory forest. And if we were in Florida, that's exactly what it would be. In this area, that's maybe not what it would be. I live over on the east side in Yakima. We don't really have trees in our climax, but we do have sagebrush and many other shrubs that are very long lived. And that is our climax community. But something that doesn't always get talked about outside of ecology classes is how disturbance is really important for having habitat. A climax community, you know, may not be the best thing out there. A lot of times you want to have a landscape that has had disturbance at many different time scales so that you have all of these different species. What do I mean about that? Okay, this is an example of a very densely grown pine forest, probably pretty old, probably hasn't seen a whole lot of fire or other disturbance in some time. Yeah, it's maybe been a while, maybe there was logging, but this hasn't been disturbed in at least 60 years, I would guess. You'll notice that there's almost no understory plants in this. This is practically a monoculture of pine trees. Now contrast that to this forest. This forest has clearly had some more disturbance. You can see fallen trees. This may have been from either logging or fires or something. There is a lot more understory in this forest. The trees are much further apart. So it lets in light to the floor. And then you'll get something like this. This might be a mix where you have these very large open areas that become meadows. And then you also have areas where there's, you know, much denser trees in the back. And there might be areas that looked more like that previous photo, all in the same area. This is a lot of times more what we'd like to see is maybe there are stands of very dense forest, but there's also open areas and there's areas where the trees are further apart. You want to have a mix of different things on the whole landscape to help with habitat for a lot of different species of things. So how do we manage this? Because, you know, we live on the landscape and there's been a very long history after the European settlers came in of fire suppression, for example, that have really drastically altered plant communities and communities in general, especially here in the West. So when you're managing disturbance, what does that maybe look like? Well, that may be increasing disturbance. So prescribed burns, managed burns. You could do mowing, selective logging, brush clearing, managing water levels if you're in a riparian area. Sometimes that can be really important because humans have changed how water moves through riparian areas quite drastically sometimes with dam removals and channel cutting. It's a whole thing. Grazing can be very important. And then there's like actual agricultural methods, which we'll talk about more in a sec. Then you can encourage succession from the other side. You know, after disturbance, what do? You can amend the soil. If it was a primary succession scenario, you can bring in topsoil. replanting, reseeding, controlling invasives. Those are all things that might encourage a later succession group. So one really good example of where people have really stepped up to kind of do this sort of thing is with mines. Restoration after mines is a huge thing, and in some cases is very successful. In other cases, it's not, but mines they're usually down to bedrock. This is going to be a primary succession scenario, and they usually are required by law to bring in topsoil and replant after mines leave an area. So this has been fairly well studied. But there's some other examples that you might not be thinking of, where humans were responsible for essentially managing disturbance on this landscape. And oak savannas are a really good example of this. It's a very common misconception that, you know, when the European settlers came to the West, they were walking through, you know, beautiful unmanaged lands, and that is, quite frankly, completely untrue. The Native Americans were here, and they were in fact managing the lands, often in a agricultural way. Oak savannas were essentially maintained by Native Americans through burning. So, you know, those climax communities of very dense trees, those might not be touched by fire for hundreds of years. Oak savannas were often burned about every 10 years. So they have a fairly high disturbance that normally occurs to maintain this plant community. And this is a really important plant community with very high diversity. If you want to learn more about oaks, and if you ever want to read something that will basically be like, oh my gosh, I need to go out right now and plant an oak, Doug Ptolemy's The Nature of Oaks is really good on that. Here's another example of human managed habitat. Camas prairies were absolutely Native American agriculture. They intensely managed these prairies for food, which was the camas bulb. And these have an incredibly high biodiversity as far as what plants grow here. So management does not mean, you're managing for a monoculture. Management can mean you're managing for diversity, and that can still, be a benefit to people, and require an actual large amount of management to maintain. So here's an example of a way that people are managing for habitat in ways that they may not be thinking about. And it's basically roadsides. So this is, a forested road where the forest comes right down to the road. There's certainly some undergrowth here. These trees are pretty old, pretty far apart. I mean, this is from a national park, I think. This is a climax community, and there's pretty good undergrowth here, but this is, the forest comes right down to the road. Versus in this scenario, this looks like really dense forest on the side, and there's a road that goes through it, but on the sides, it looks like these get mowed fairly regularly, and this keeps trees from growing right next to the road. You get this opening in the forest, and that allows for basically non-forest, more of an open, lots of forbs and grasses and stuff to come in. And, you can do that. This is not a great example, but I couldn't find a better photo. You can have cutouts in roads that even increase that amount of habitat and basically make these openings just based on mowing that you would normally do along a road. So you can actually increase certain types of habitat by maintaining roads. And pollinators actually are one of the great beneficiaries to this. Roads that have these open areas next to them often support very high pollinator numbers. And studies have shown that, you know, the increase in habitat is way more than enough to offset any, you know, bees and butterflies that get hit by cars going by. You know, they wouldn't be there otherwise because there wouldn't be a population to begin with. So, you know, having bike paths and stuff that have these sort of cutouts can really help maintain, you know, really good pollinator habitat. So note on invasive species really quick. Invasive species are obviously not good. Why? Because they can outcompete natives. Sometimes they can pass diseases onto natives. They are often pioneer species, so they typically like more disturbed habitat, especially with soil disturbance, like what happens in agriculture. It's not always the case, but it's often the case. And so besides like directly competing with natives and eating natives and passing diseases on to natives, a really big factor on invasive species is that they can change the normal disturbance regime. So what do I mean by that? Hold that thought. I forgot I put these in first. So honeybees, a note on honeybees, because honeybees are really considered an invasive species. They're not native to the Americas, but modern agriculture pretty heavily relies on them. I don't know why there's the bee in the middle of that. They are generalists. So they're not, you know, they're out there pollinating a lot of things. And if you have a very depauperate plant community already, they can kind of help get that jump started because they will go out there and they will pollinate a whole lot of different things. But they're not necessarily the best thing to have in very, very high densities, especially in more natural areas. So if you're very passionate about helping bees and you're like, I'm thinking of getting into beekeeping because I want to help bees, please keep in mind that the best example I have for that is if you wanted to help our native songbirds, you would probably not go out and get chickens to do that. You know, honeybees and beekeeping is great. And if you do want to get into that, you know, please do join a local beekeeping club. It's fine. But if you really want to help, you know, the birds and the bees and stuff like that, create habitat instead. They are really cool. I love honeybees. They're super fascinating in their behavior and I just love them to death, but they are an invasive species. But they are an invasive species that really likes forests. In their native range, they are a forest dwelling species, and they give kind of an example of a bee that does actually appreciate a more mature forest community than some of these other species might. Because this is their jam. And if you want to learn more about, you know, honeybees in their native range, doing what wild honeybees do, this is a great book for it. Fantastic photos. Anyway, so yeah, the change in disturbance regime. If you've been to the east side, you may have seen this. This is cheatgrass. It's also on the west side. It's kind of everywhere because it's evil, evil plant. The real problem with cheatgrass is that it changes the fire regime, especially in sagebrush steppe communities. A lot of the forests on the west side, the beautiful mature pine forests that we all know and love, a lot of those do have a fairly long disturbance regime where they would maybe only have fire every 100 to 200 years. Granted, there would still be fire, and a lot of the fires that we're seeing nowadays are because of a lot longer term time than that of fire suppression. So there's a difference in a low intensity wildfire and a high intensity wildfire, just so you know. But basically, there's a really long time in between wildfires in some of the forests on the west side. This is actually also the case for sagebrush steppe habitat. Normally, there is a very long period of time in between burns. Sagebrush takes a very long time to come back from a wildfire. So why is cheatgrass a problem? It's because it forms these mats of vegetation that catch on fire really, really easily. And this has resulted in the burn frequency in our sagebrush increasing drastically to the point where the sagebrush hasn't had a chance to come back in certain areas. So, this is a landscape with cheatgrass on it. What is it supposed to look like? This is what it always comes back to. This is what it's supposed to look like. There's supposed to be lots of forbs, lots of native bunch grasses. You can see bare dirt in between these. This is why, normally this wouldn't burn very frequently, because these patches of bare ground in between the plants would essentially let the fire extinguish itself. And of course, you can see lots of shrubs and no trees. That's not because of disturbance, that's because of the moisture content that we normally get over here. So there's a lot of factors that will influence what the climax community should be in an area. Rainfall is definitely one of those things, but so is disturbance. Anyway, this is what it should look like and not just cheatgrass. So here's another example of what can happen when you do invasive species removal. This is in a more forest area. Removal of Chinese privet, which is sort of an understory type shrub, small tree. When that was removed, suddenly, there's this incredibly diverse understory of lots of different forbs that was able to flourish when that wasn't present. So invasive species can really change what the landscape looks like, and that's why they're so bad. Okay, so where are the pollinators in all of this? Well, realistically, you will have different pollinators in all of these, from when the annuals start coming back all the way through to the climax community. But you will find most of the pollinators just in this area, where there are very diverse annuals, perennial forbs, and shrubs that are flowering. Mature forest climax communities will have certain species of pollinators that require that. So, don't say it's always a bad thing, because there are going to be some in there, but you'll get the most diversity somewhere in this sweet spot where there's, open area and very diverse forbs. So here's a example from OSU of, different types of bees that are found in different areas. And yeah, bumblebees may be nesting in tree snags and nests underground that a forest creates, but you're going to find a whole lot of other bees out in this more open area. So that's kind of very basic primer on community ecology. And if you guys have questions about it, I'm happy to answer them later. But that's kind of managing on a landscape level. What about in your own backyard? You're probably not going to be doing prescribed burns in your backyard unless you have like 5 acres, in which case, awesome. But consult your local fire chiefs. So what can you do in your own backyard? How do you think about pollinators in your backyard and create habitat for them? Well, because you're probably intensely managing your backyard, unlike some of these landscapes where you're maybe just like, I'm just going to burn it every couple of years. That'll maintain it. Nesting habitat, larval hosts, and nectar and pollen sources are kind of what you're looking at for encouraging pollinator diversity. So nesting habitat can be a lot of different things. And got all out of order. So for also, please reduce your pesticide use. If you don't need to use a pesticide, then don't use it. So nesting habitat for bees can be actually really, really easy. Don't till your ground as much as possible. Leave natural, semi-natural areas. Don't remove dead wood if you can help it. If it's going to fall on your house, then you can take out that dead tree. But honestly, like the easiest thing to do is when you're mulching your yard, because mulching suppresses weeds and invasive species, just leave a few patches that aren't mulched. Remember, most bees nest in the ground, so they need access to that soil to be able to dig their nest in. Or even just, very, very lightly mulch a few areas if you're going for aesthetic type things. It's basically that simple for bees, for many bees anyway. There are bees, like I said, that nest in like hollow stems. We have certain native plants like blackberries, not all blackberries, ninebark, and certain other ones that have hollow stems. And the way you can create nesting habitat for those types of species is to trim those bushes on occasion, but not too far back, just enough that some of the ends of the stems are exposed. All right, providing floral sources for food. So many, especially of the social species, and remember we are trying to actually encourage bumblebees, which are a social species present nearly year round. Those require year-round floral resources. But one of the questions is, a lot of bees are specialists. So if you're trying to attract specific bee species, what do you plant? And honestly, it really depends on the species that you're trying to attract. There are a lot of generalists that do go to a wide variety of plants. But if you're trying to attract, a specialist on sunflowers, because that's the longhorn bees are specialists on sunflowers, you need to plant sunflowers. That's kind of how that works. Anyway, so it really just kind of honestly, it comes down to like, what flowers do you enjoy? You'll probably attract bees that go to those flowers. So as long as you kind of reverse search which bees are going to which flowers, you'll eventually get something. Remember I said most bees are solitary. Some people are like, well, I don't want bees in my backyard because they might sting me. Solitary bees, super hard to get them to sting you. The only person that I know who's actually been stung by a solitary bee was a postdoc that I worked with, and it was a green sweat bee. And we had just spent 20 minutes trying to pry an ant that was like hanging off of the bee's wings. So we were messing with it for 20 minutes. Finally stung him. The only reaction that he had was saying, ow. No swelling, nothing else. It was just kind of like, oh, maybe we should stop messing with it now. They're very non-aggressive. So if you don't want honeybees, there are other options out there, and we'll discuss some of them. A concern that we've had previously when we're saying, nesting habitat besides those non-mulched areas, you could do these things like these bee houses. Or, you take a block of wood and you drill holes in it, and that creates nesting habitat. And now that we have Houdini fly, we're saying no, please don't do that. It concentrates all the mason bees and leafcutter bees in one area, and you get a lot higher parasitism rates if you do that and you don't clean it out. So what we are recommending is over in this corner where there are blocks of wood that stack on top of each other. And so you can take them apart and clean them out every year. And you do that in the winter and basically like clean the bee cocoons and make sure that, you toss any that are parasitized and only keep the healthy ones. And then you put them back outside in the spring and they'll emerge and everything is great. And you've just, eliminated actually a source of parasitism and taken them out. So that's what we're now recommending for stuff like mason bees and a lot of leaf cutter bees. Is the bamboo is too hard to take apart and you have to get new bamboo and it's just a pain. So go with this if you want to encourage bees. Also, these butterfly houses, the little slits that you'll see in some of these, yeah, they're more likely to attract wasps than they are butterflies. So don't even bother. Anyway, yes, the easiest way to provide nesting habitat for native bees, leave some patches of bare ground, because right there is a little bee nest. This is, by the way, what the leafcutter bee larvae look like inside their little wrapped up leaf cocoons. There's this pollen ball in here and this little, maggoty looking thing. That's a bee larva. They look like maggots. It's not really that appetizing. But so if you want to learn more about bees, I do recommend The Bees in Your Backyard. It's a really great book. But to attract more of them in general, remember, many specialists here, in general, bees like yellow, white, and blue colored or purple colored flowers. Open flowers are very popular because pretty much any type of pollinator can access this sort of aster type flower. Plants in the mint family tend to be very popular with a lot of bees a lot of times. So things that won't attract bees. If you have these, beautiful cultivars that are just like all petal, that's not very attractive to bees. If you have a lawn that is nothing but grass, not very attractive to bees. Things that are attractive to bees are these wild types. So this is a wild type dahlia. You'll notice that a bee can actually access this. This is a wild rose. Very accessible by bees. Bees are all over wild roses. And if you have a lawn and you want to keep your lawn, I recommend clover. And there's some other really great, things that you can plant in there like yarrow and self-heal and some other stuff that you can add to your lawn that will make it actually attractive to bees. Just, then you can't walk on it barefoot anymore. Hummingbirds, very popular. Hummingbirds are super cool. I definitely recommend the Hummingbird Handbook. If you have an interest in them, it has a whole bunch of information about gardening specifically for hummingbirds. But in general, they tend to go for white, pink, orange, or red flowers that have these very long tubular shaped flowers. And I realize that's a bumblebee. But this is a firecracker penstemon, and this is a great hummingbird plant. Besides bumblebees, I see hummingbirds on this all the time. Remember, wasps, flies, and beetles are also pollinators, and you will definitely see them on all kinds of flowers. Yarrow attracts loads of pollinating flies and wasps that are super cool to watch. Same with black-eyed Susans. Butterflies and moths. Please remember, unlike bees, their hosts actually need other things to, or their larvae need other things to eat than flowers, usually. There are actually caterpillars that we have that are native that actually eat flowers. Not eat from, but eat flowers. So you do actually need to remember to plant larval hosts. And some very common ones, we have native violets. The anise swallowtail feasts on dill and fennel. You can plant, and parsley, you can plant these in your garden, and just keep in mind you will see caterpillars on them eating them. That doesn't mean you should be spraying the plants. You want those there. Another note about water and mud, honeybees especially, basically consider them a mammal that is trying to maintain their body temperature. And when it gets really hot, they actually need water to cool themselves down. So they will be highly attracted to sources of water. Butterflies, especially the males, like to do something called mudding. They're not really so much getting water as they're getting salts and minerals from the mud. And they use that to, well, help them create more sperm. So you can help attract butterflies and bees if you have a muddy section in your yard that you kind of maintain regularly. That could just be a leaky faucet or whatever you want to do. So I'm going to walk you through really briefly this area this is my backyard, and what I think about when I'm trying to encourage pollinators. So in my lawn area, I clearly have in this photo lots of clover. I have a ton of native bees that are coming to my clover. They're very tiny, so you probably won't notice them a lot of the time. But they're little sweat bees. And besides that, I also have, honeybee colonies, and I see honeybees on them all the time too. So clover in your lawn, check. Flower beds. Obviously have these beautiful flower beds with some irises that kind of came with my house that I haven't totally pulled out yet. This is catmint in the corner, and it's a mint. It's in the mint family. I have bees on that all the time. Fruits and vegetables. This is a row along the fence line of raspberries and blackberries. All kinds of bees on that. That used to be juniper. Juniper, not very attractive to pollinators, but blackberries and raspberries sure are. Ground cover mulch bare ground. So I do try to mulch a lot of my flower beds, but I make sure that there are patches of bare ground. So this area right under the trellis is actually a bulb garden. That typically doesn't get mulched. The area under my raspberries and blackberries, I probably should mulch, but I leave a lot of that unmulched. Water. There is a faucet right here. It has traditionally been fairly leaky, and we try to maintain that at a slow leak because that leaks into a little bowl that I have with stones in it for my honeybees, which are right over off the corner on a patio, like to go to. Pesticide use. Pretty much the only thing that I spray with harsh pesticides is my apple tree in my front yard, because otherwise that gets so much codling moth. Everything else, I usually use neem oil. And when I am spraying those really harsh pesticides on that apple tree, I spray in the evening. A lot of pesticide labels, you can read them and they will tell you, do not spray when bees are active in the area. That means spray in the evening after they've gone home. So when they come out in the morning, they're not going to get affected. I really don't like codling moth, but I do tolerate damage on many of my other plants. So I plant milkweed everywhere. I have, fennel and dill and parsley everywhere. I have violets everywhere. They're in my lawn. They're everywhere. All of those are host plants for different types of caterpillars. So I just get really excited when I see a caterpillar, and a lot of people would see damage. Most plants can have like 60% of their leaves be eaten and be totally fine. 100%, okay. maybe you need to do some control at that point, unless they're, monarch butterflies eating milkweed, then you're like, yeah. But learn to tolerate some damage on your plants. I'm going to go through that. Okay, so how do you get started? Use what you already have. Go through your yard. What is already attracting bees and butterflies in your yard? Maybe you should keep that. You can buy plants from nurseries or plant sales. The master gardeners, we have an arboretum, the conservation districts, they all have plant sales, a lot of times for native plants. You can ask friends for seedlings or cuttings. You can plant seeds on bare ground, start your own plants from seed, buy and plant bulbs. I now grow camas in my yard because I found bulbs. So I use a combination of different methods, whatever works for you. And you can start really small. You can start with a very small area. So this is an example from my yard.
Katie, this is Lisa. I just want to jump in and mention that it's 12:01, and I see that we've got folks that are having to jump off. So I wanted to give you a second to wrap up, and then we can make sure that people can get back to their days as well.
Okay.
A couple more minutes. Sound good?
Couple more minutes. I'll go through these really fast.
Great.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, this was done after we removed English ivy and a blue spruce that had been topped. So I started, this was a variety of methods. I bought from plant sales, I spread seeds, I put stuff that was in one area of my yard that shouldn't have been there. And I saved, these beautiful coreopsis that were already there. And, I add to it every year and just try to increase the diversity of what's growing there. And, it looks absolutely gorgeous now. This was in June, not this morning. This is where I tried to encroach on my lawn. We had these bare patches in our lawn that we really didn't like, so I decided I was going to put in another flower bed. So I removed the sod, put in some root barriers so that the grass didn't re-encroach, used cardboard to suppress weeds. I planted like 400 bulbs, mulched everything, started seeds myself, not inside. You start them outside in the fall so that they overwinter outside. They got snow on them. Try to get something with as big a root section as possible. And, last year we started having bulbs come up and they were beautiful. So, bulbs for the first year are great. I started planting stuff out and, by the end of the year, I had stuff starting to bloom. I may have planted some stuff a little bit too close. Fireweed. Here's a successional plant for you. It's named because it blooms after fires. So, these are all things that are native over here on the east side. Some of them are native on the west side too. This is one of my favorites. Unfortunately, it's really more of a dry side. But yeah, that's what happened, the first year. And this was this year in June. And yeah, it's very spectacular. This is what it looks like now. A lot of stuff has dried out a bit. That's what happens here in the summer. But the fireweed and goldenrod are still blooming. I will say you will have successes and failures. This is one of my failures. I tried to plant globe mallow. I could not get this plant to sprout. I'm going to have to try again this winter. I really want this plant because one, it's really pretty and it basically acts as kind of a lower ground cover, but also because we have this native bee that only goes to globe mallow. This is a globe mallow specialist, Diadasia diminuta, the globe mallow bee. So I really want to see if I can get this bee in my yard if I plant globe mallow. So again, how can you help? Plant more flowers, create habitat, use IPM, don't spray if you don't need to, plant more flowers, and you can learn more about your local pollinators. If you do have a pesticide issue, you see a pesticide issue, here's my slide, please report it to us. please, because we can't do anything if we don't know about it. And you can learn more at all of these different organizations. I will go back to this slide if you guys need me to. Oops. But yeah, do you guys have any questions? And there's my email as well, so you can ask me anything.
Thank you so much, Katie. What an excellent presentation. I definitely learned a lot, especially about what's happening at the state level. I think we often are kind of focused in on our Puget Sound work and our Green Seattle work. And so it's really helpful to understand all the people out there advocating for pollinators in our region. I am going to just, because we can keep going if we want to, I am going to just make sure that we get to one question at least today. We had a question from Ed. It landed in the chat, so I'm getting back to it. How widespread are bombus impatiens here in Seattle?
They're becoming increasingly widespread, and there are citizen science campaigns aimed at mapping out the spread. So if you want to get involved in that, the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas is a great way to get involved. That's not only for bombus impatiens, that's for all of our bumblebee species. And that's a great way to start learning about what bumblebees are in your yard and in your area. And they've started posting reports on what plants you can plant to increase bumblebees.
That's a great example. I actually just became a Bumblebee Atlas volunteer this last summer as well. And it's super fun and interesting to learn about. I'll post the link here for folks to take some time and visit the website. And I think it's, for folks that are involved with Green Seattle Partnership, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to think about together ways that we can take care of pollinators in our restoration sites, but also start looking at more monitoring. So if anybody has good ideas, feel free to reach out. You can find more information about Green Seattle Partnership at the website, www.greenseattle.org. I did include several links as well as a PDF from our field practicum that happened in August at Discovery Park. If you're interested in, looking at those resources in particular, May has included the website there for folks who are not so familiar with Green Seattle. And unless we have a final question, just checking our question board, I think that will wrap it up there. Actually, if you want to jump to one couple slides, there we go. I did want to point out two things before we head off. We do have lots of resources available, including all the past webinars that have been hosted. They exist on the Green Seattle YouTube page. That's linked there. Of course, you can always just Google that. Or when you're at our website, you can look at the resources for forest stewards, and there's lots of links there. And the next slide, click through once more. I wanted to make a plug, just backwards one, sorry. I wanted to make a plug for Seattle Forest Week. For those familiar with Green Seattle Partnership, you know that every year we host Green Seattle Day to kick off the planting season. And this is a great opportunity to come out and practice a lot of what Katie shared today and learn what it looks like in Seattle parks to build habitat. So Green Seattle Day will be on October 29th this year. And Arbor Day will be on October 23rd. And so the week between will be celebrating all things Seattle Forest. So please join us, check out the website there to learn more as well. And on that note, we'll leave everybody. Thank you again for your time today, and we'll look forward to catching up more. Take care.